Among the world's first-class cricketers, the record of Ian William Johnson is unique and unchallengeable. He captained Australia at home and in England, and also led the first visits by Australian teams to India, Pakistan and the West Indies. The son of W.J. Johnson, a Victorian player and Australian selector, Ian also became the son-in-law of 1920 Test representative Dr. Roy Park. In a first-class career spanning 21 years, 1933 to 1956, Ian established an enviable all-round record as an off-spinner, versatile batsman and fine fieldsman. He became secretary of the Melbourne Cricket Club in 1957 and retired in 1983. Here is Ian Johnson interviewed by Tony Charlton in the MCC committee dining room in 1987.
Well, here we are at the great ground which has played such a prominent part in your life. And in fact, the 1987 grand final has only been finished a couple of days, Carlton winning the flag for the 15th time. Did you see it?
No, I didn't see it this year, Tony. It's the first one I've missed for over 30 years, and it's only about the second one I've missed since the war, really.
Well, more of football later in our discussion, but let's go back to your sporting beginning. Your father's influence on your cricket career.
Well, it was probably an influence by example more than anything else, because he played with North Melbourne. He also represented Victoria, and I used to go along as a kid and look at the pennant matches in which North were playing, and I'd go down to practice with him. And that was the influence that he had, although I remember at one time at practice, old Billy Carlton, a famous old name in cricket, he gave me a bit of coaching using the clock system. He'd get halfway down the wicket and throw one up to me and say, hit it to 3 o'clock. Hit it to 2 o'clock, hit it to 7 o'clock, 5 o'clock, and gave a wide range of strokes. It was a very, very good form of coaching, actually.
Was it a matter of disappointment to Dad and the family that you ended up at South Melbourne and not at North?
I think it was, yes. Of course, it was rather interesting because when I was living in South Melbourne at the time, the district scheme was such that I had to play with South Melbourne. There was no father-son rule or anything like that. But the rule was changed later, where you were allowed to play for the club your father played for, and my brother did in fact play for North Melbourne.
And you then progressed to Wesley College, one of the 6 great schools of Victoria.
That's right, Tony, but before that I think it's important to say that I was at Middle Park Central School, and South Melbourne Cricket Club at that stage used to encourage the boys from the various schools in the area. And there was Snowy Davidson and Frank Morton, who was the secretary. They had this class of children on a Monday, and it was a wonderful formative stage for me because you got some excellent coaching from them. They were both very fine players, and I think that that made me long to play with South Melbourne anyhow. Then I went on to Wesley, of course.
And their coaching skills were paralleled by the redoubtable P.L. Williams, Pills.
P.L. was wonderful. He was, I remember his attitude was when he got a half volley, hit the ball. He didn't go into any detailed coaching. He let you develop your own style and encouraged your own style.
Now, some of your contemporaries and your predecessors at Wesley also won fame in sport. Can you mention a few?
Well, the contemporaries were Ross Gregory and Eddie Williams. They were both a bit older than I was. Ross, of course, played cricket for Australia, and he was lost during the war. He was, I think, an observer. Eddie was in the army, and he played with the services side after the war. And then later on, after me, of course, there was Sam Loxton, and they were quite, as a matter of fact, in the 4 years I was at Wesley playing in the cricket team, we won every match, so I was quite happy about that.
Fantastic. How did you personally fare in the public schools competition?
Oh, I did fairly well. In the last couple of years, I did particularly well. In the first 2 years, of course, I was rather overshadowed by the talent in the side.
Now, while at Wesley, you were quite outstanding, really. You must have been, because you played for South Melbourne.
Yes, in fact, I played for South Melbourne seconds when I was at Middle Park School when I was about 14. And I played for the first when I was 16. When I was at Wesley. I played during the school holidays, actually.
Was that a premature indoctrination, or did it do you good?
I think it did me a lot of good, yes. As a matter of fact, the first match I had with South Melbourne was on a sticky wicket against Fitzroy with Maury Sievers in great form, and I made top score of 17, so I felt that I carried my weight, and that sort of secured me a place in the side.
There were some great names at South at the time. Recall some of them.
Oh, yes. There was Lindsay Hassett, Ian Lee, Laurie Nash, and a year or two later than I was there, Keith Miller came along, Billy Cornelius. Oh, there were a great Roy Howard, Keith Kendall, a great bevy of names down there. It's a great club.
Yeah, remarkable. We could talk about that at some length.
Yes.
You broke a bone in your arm. Tell us whereabouts and what influence that had on your cricket.
Well, I broke it. We were playing a game called Post at Middle Park School when I was around about 12 or 13. And with that, you were playing with a tennis ball and you used to hit it underarm up against a post. I was tripped over and I chipped a bone in the elbow. And ever since then, I had lots of physiotherapy from old Alf Bridges, the old wrestling referee. And but it never really corrected itself, and in fact I can't pronate my arm properly. I can only get it halfway round. That's as far as I could get that when you see it as distinct from that. And also there's a permanent bend in it. And this, of course, caused them at times to say that I threw the ball when I was bowling. But in fact I couldn't straighten my arm, so I was really legitimate.
You graduated fairly quickly, as I understand it, to the Victorian 11.
Yes, I first played for the Victorian second 11 when I was 17. I was at school, and it was rather amusing. There were two masters from the school, Jack Kroger and Val Brown, in the same side that went to Tasmania. And of course I begrudged the fact that here I was going on my first cricket trip, and I had two masters from the school in the team with me. It was only in later years that I realised that they must have felt it a lot more than I did to have a school kid with them in the team.
You're in the Victorian 11 still as a schoolboy and as a batsman, not bowler.
Yes, well, I really developed my bowling at Wesley, and it was just really by accident because I wanted to be in the game all the time. And I was primarily a batsman in the early years and was selected to Victoria as a batsman who did a little bit of bowling.
Did you justify your selection from the outset?
I think so. I did fairly well in Tasmania that trip. It was when the Australian team was in South Africa, and so the Shield sides were slightly weakened, but I didn't get into the Shield side for another year or so, and once I was in it, I was never dropped from it at all.
Must have been enormous pressure on you, the kid playing with these great names that you had revered. Was it difficult for you to adapt and absorb the pressure?
No, I don't think so, Tony. It was an inspiration, really, and you felt quite exhilarated by it. You weren't overwhelmed by their presence, but you were excited by it, and it really did lift your game, I think.
Now, you named a couple, but mention some more who were with you in the Victorian side.
Well, when I first started, there was Keith Rigg, then there was Ian Lee, Ben Barnett, Gordon Tamblin, Des Fothergill, Keith Miller, Doug Ring.
So with few exceptions, it was the nursery for the Australian 11.
No question about it at all. It was, because in those days the Shield cricket was quite a big thing, and I mean you used to get 15 to 25,000 people to the matches. And of course the big thing about it then was that it was a real nursery, because the test players used to play in most of the important Shield matches, and therefore all of the players in the Shield side were being blooded against test match players.
It's not that way today.
It's not that way today, and you're finding that there are chaps going into a test match now who have never played against the test cricket. They haven't played against the Australian test cricketers. You've got a case like Steve Waugh. I think I'd be right in saying he's played more, or far more international matches than he has Sheffield Shield matches. Well, I think this is a weakness.
A matter of regret.
Oh, great regret, because I think that it has had an adverse effect on Australian cricket.
Now, the name of Lindsay Hassett has perhaps had the greatest significance in your entire cricketing career.
Yes, and I think he's probably been the biggest influence on it. Lindsay and I started together at South Melbourne. I was with him when he made the famous 7 or 8 ducks in a row, then went to the Colts and was dropped 3 times before he broke his duck, and then went on to make 160 and never looked back. But Lindsay had the big influence because it was Lindsay who was really responsible for my captaining Australia. We used to go to a party on New Year's Eve every year, and it was usually at a time when we were playing South Australia. And in 53-4, Lindsay had retired when he came back from England, and I was made captain of Victoria. We got to this New Year's Eve party, and Lindsay said to me, "You're not trying." I said, "Well, I'm only going to play this year, then I'll give it away." I said, "So I'm going to enjoy it." He said, "You're a so-and-so fool. You want to get stuck into it," and he gave me a hell of a burst and said, "Get stuck into it because you can captain Australia, the only one who can do the job." And of course I got a bit niggly with him, and it spurred me quite a bit. I came out next day and I wasn't thinking of captaining Australia, I was thinking of showing Hassett. and I got 4 wickets against South Australia. Then I got 4 in the second innings. Went to Sydney, I got 5 up in Sydney. Then we went to Perth, I got 2 the first innings, 6 the second innings. And then we followed that at Adelaide, and I got 6 in each innings. And I attribute it all to Lindsay, and of course I went on to captain Australia. And I attribute the whole lot of it to that talk that Lindsay gave me at about 3 o'clock in the morning, before we were playing the next day, incidentally. And I attribute the whole thing to that, because otherwise I would have just drifted through the season and probably dropped out of the game after captaining Victoria.
2 points. Few would appreciate that he was of that influence in your captaincy. And second point, that you necessarily were unchallenged for that role. Did you see yourself as being the heir apparent once he mentioned it?
Oh, no, I didn't see it at all. I didn't even think about it. But all I did, I thought, well, I'll show that Hassett that I can really bowl a bit. But no, I never thought about the captaincy. No, I wasn't unchallenged. No, Keith Miller was a very keen rival. And I think Arthur Morris too, although they played both played for New South Wales.
Now, the Second World War intervened early in your first-class career, and you went into the service. So many others did, and you chose the RAF. Why was that?
Well, I was in the University Rifles before the war. I didn't enjoy army life all that much, but I'd always felt that I'd like to fly. And there's an association between sport and flying, of course, and I just liked the idea of flying. And that's why I joined the RAF and hoped I'd become a pilot, which I did, fortunately.
What association do you see between sport and flying?
Well, they're both a challenge. They're both an individual type thing which rely on teamwork. Now, if I can explain that when you're flying with a squadron, you've got to be part of a team. But also, there's a lot of individuality comes into it, so that it's really a contest, a personal contest between you and the enemy. And it's much the same as in sport, really.
In the RAF, you ended up with what rank?
Flight lieutenant.
Flight lieutenant. Mm-hmm. Where did your career as a pilot take you?
Well, I started off, I was posted to 3 Squadron in the desert. And we were waiting to go, but the Japs came into the war. Our postings were cancelled. Then I was put onto instruction for a period. I did elementary instruction, and then I was posted to Beaufighters, and I flew in the Southwest Pacific area on Beaufighters.
The best plane you ever flew?
I liked them best of all. Of course, I flew about 15 different types of planes. Apart from the training planes, most of them were twin-engined. I had one go at a 4-engine job, but they were the best. I liked the Mosquito, but I preferred the Beaufighter to them all. But of course, the one I'd love to have flown was a Spitfire.
Was there any cricket while you were away?
Nothing to speak of. We used to play a few service games now and then, but you never practiced. You'd turn up on a Saturday and have a bit of a game. But I always did have a game with South Melbourne when I was on leave. They tolerated me, even though I was hopelessly out of form.
Now, I think your post-war career is well documented, and so it should be, culminating with your captaincy of the Australian 11, about which we've spoken. Just give us some of the highlights as they occur to you off the cuff.
Well, I suppose one of the great highlights was being a member of the 48 side and playing with and against Don Bradman in that phase of my career, and being under him in the 48 side and against England and India in Australia. That was a great thrill. Then, of course, I think that probably the tour of the West Indies was another great moment, because we went over there. There was talk about white Australia policy in the West Indies, and a few agitators were about, and we were expected to be given a very hostile reception, as the English team had been the previous year. But we were given a wonderful welcome, and we were reported to have been the most popular side that ever toured there. I loved every moment of it. I loved the people, and that, I think, was the highlight. Another highlight, of course, was captaining a winning side at Lord's in '56, when we hadn't been going too well, but we got to Lord's and we got a good fastish wicket, and we beat England rather convincingly. That was a great thrill.
The difference between the rumour and the reality of your West Indies tour, why was that so?
Well, the Englishmen had had a terribly torrid time the previous year. They were stones thrown at them, bottles thrown at them. They were imprisoned in the hotel by mobs outside. There were riots all the time. And it was anticipated that with the White Australia policy, which applied in Australia then, that we would get a very hostile reception.
Yeah, why was it not so? That's my point.
The team was wonderfully cooperative, but I think one of the things that helped us was we won the press immediately, because when we arrived at Kingston in Jamaica, a crowd of English press were out there to see the action, and they grabbed Keith Miller and myself. And we were talking with them, and suddenly I saw some of the West Indies, or people I anticipated with the West Indies press, standing back, not coming forward, and obviously feeling that we weren't going to want anything to do with them, and bearing out the fears we had. I said to Keith, never mind about these Poms, let's go over and see the West Indies boys, come on. So I grabbed Keith and dragged him across. The English boys protested, we told them where to go. We went across to the West Indies press, and Keith and I put on a bit of a turn with them. They were most appreciative of us, and from then on we got wonderful press while we were over there. And remember, we won. We were the only team to have beaten the West Indies 3-love, the only team ever to have whitewashed them in the West Indies, and it was anticipated that when you're beating them all sorts of things would happen, but they didn't. The people were good to us, and it was a wonderful tour.
So some diplomacy and some good judgment.
And a bit of good luck.
I've asked you about the high spots, and you've chronicled those briefly. What about the low spots?
Well, I suppose one of my low spots was when I made a pair on the Melbourne ground here. I got LBW first ball to Norman Yardley and run out for a blob in the second dig. But that apart, that was a bit amusing. I think probably the low spot was in England in '56, when after we beat England at Lord's on a fastest wicket, the rest of the wickets were made for spinners, for Laker and Locke. And that disillusioned me, because I really believed that the wickets were doctored. I heard various stories attributed to Peter May, that they won't get another wicket like that one at Lord's. Told Frank Tyson that you won't be worried, want it again, Frank. They won't get that wicket again. And we didn't. And that was a great disillusionment to me, to think that England would play the game that way. And the fact that we struck those wickets, that was a low spot.
How did you hold the team together in the circumstances, or did they rise to the occasion?
Well, we played very well in the county games, but in the test matches, on the wickets that we had, there was absolutely no hope. I mean, I rather feel that even the 48 side would have been struggling in '56 in the conditions that we struck.
Did anybody of consequence in the MCC administration ever declare their hand on the matter and say that you were right?
No. During the centenary test in 1977, Freddie Brown said to me, some of your ideas were right in '56. He said, have a word with Geoffrey Howard, who was then the secretary of Old Trafford, where we struck the first of the second of our bad ones. He said, he'll tell you a few home truths. And there were stories that one senior official in England had sent the instructions out. I remember the curator at Old Trafford saying to us one day, when it was at the time of sewers, two things he said. He said, don't bloody well blame me for the wickets, it's not my fault. That was fairly condemnatory. And the other one was, he said, oh, thank God for bloody sewers. It's got me off the front page.
Now, as briefly mentioned earlier in our talk, you played with and against the great man, and as written, the world shall never see the likes of him again. Just give us your own personal impressions of Bradman as a man.
Well, I'd need a lot longer than I have to do it, Tony. I had a tremendous regard for him. He was a shy person. He had a slight inferiority complex, I think, and that caused him to make some sharp retorts now and then. But he was a wonderful man, I think. He was most cooperative in all the ways. He was a fine captain, and easily the best captain I've ever struck, because his knowledge of cricket and his cricket brain was fantastic. I mean, when he came, and when you were bowling, he'd come along and he'd say, well, now, what about if we move so-and-so from here to there, because this batsman's doing such and such a thing, you see? And well, you'd obviously agree with him. And then if you wanted to change someone, he'd say, well, why do you want to do it? Well, Don, because I think he's doing so-and-so. He'd always come back with either one of two things. Well, I think it's a good idea, we'll try it. Or else he'd say, well, I don't like it very much, but we'll try it if you want to. Well, of course, you didn't do it then. And that was his whole approach to it. He wasn't a strict disciplinarian. He wanted you to be fit when you went onto the field, but he didn't care what you did at night. and that's his captaincy was absolutely superb. As a man, I already said that I thought he was outstanding. As a batsman, there's no need to talk about his batting. It was so supreme. But generally, he was a wonderful character. He's been a tremendous influence and a tremendous ambassador for Australia all the time.
Now, I just can't let it go, your comment that Bradman's batting speaks for itself. There's a great thirst, and there always will be, for an insight into just how great he was. Maybe you could express it.
Well, I think probably two stories. One is that Viv Richards is a great player, and people are aware of Viv Richards. They're aware of Greg Chappell. Well, now, Viv Richards at his best was the same. It was like Bradman was all the time. That was just par for the course for Bradman, and he used to exceed that standard of excellence on occasions. He was just phenomenal. There was one instance in 1935-36 when the Australian team was in South Africa. Bradman didn't go, and I think he made 300 on the Melbourne ground here. Stan Quinn was the wicketkeeper, standing in for Ben Barnett. And Quinn said to me, I was waiting for Bradman to miss one so I could take it, hoping he'd snick it, mind you, and I was so keyed up to make sure I didn't fumble a ball that got past him. He said in the whole of those 300 runs, there wasn't one ball got past Bradman's bat. No ball beat him, and he didn't allow any ball to pass. He hit every ball that was bowled to him in making 300 runs. Now that's just, it's just incredible, and this is typical of the man.
How did Ian Johnson bowl to him?
Well, with a bit of despair. See, the point about bowling at Bradman, it wasn't such an overawing experience because he reduced every bowler to a common level. And you'd bowl at him and you knew you had as much chance of getting him out. Well, you didn't get him out. What happened was that he'd get out when you were bowling if you happened to be fortunate. And I remember one time I was bowling at him. It was the first time I got him out. Now, I always say the first time, Tony, because it gives the impression that there were lots of other times.
There was the only one.
No, there was one other, so I can say the first time. I was bowling in Adelaide, and I was bowling very well at the other batsman. But with Don, he was just coming down. I was bowling to 5 men on the on and 4 on the off. He was coming down and pushing me for singles and for twos, and the other batsman was struggling, but it was no effort to him. And in despair, I thought, I'll bowl him a cutter. Now, I had an open offside field, and I thought, my God, if I bowl him a leg cutter, he'll carve it through the off to the boundary. But I thought, oh, damn, what the hell? So I went up and I bowled the cutter and looked up tentative to see it go through the covers for 4. And then all at once it suddenly occurred to me, Don was coming down and he was going to push it to the onside. And I thought for a moment he hasn't picked it. It cut from the leg, it missed his bat by about 2 inches, and here he was stranded down the wicket, and I thought, oh my God, Bill Baker, who was a keeper, is sure to miss it. Took an age for the ball to get there, but Bill didn't miss it, he took it, and I thought he'll miss the stumps when he strikes for him. He didn't, he took the stumps. I thought the blasted umpire won't give him out. The umpire said yes and put his finger up, and Don looked up, he grinned, he walked to the pavilion, and I was absolutely stunned. I remember clearly. I walked around the wicket, I picked out a blade of grass and started to suck it, then walked around the wicket again, and really I was in a state of stunned euphoria because I'd got his wicket. And that's how it was with him. But in actual fact, what happened when you were bowling to him, he had to get out sometime, and you just hoped that you'd be bowling when he got out.
Bradman, the administrator.
Oh, well, of course, he was outstanding. I mean, and it was a great tribute to him that he did give so much time to the administration of cricket. And with his keen brain, with his knowledge of the game, well, of course, he would have been a dominant force on the Board of Control.
And as an ambassador for the game without peer?
Well, I wouldn't say without peer, but certainly there's been no one better. There have been probably some as good, but there's been no one better. He's been a great tribute to the game, and the fact that his name has lived on so much. I see he was in Jack Cannon a couple of years ago, ran a quiz, and he was named as the #1 Australian of all of them, the whole blasted lot, not sportsman, #1 Australian, because he was his renown.
I think you'd be right. Lindsay Hassett paid you the supreme compliment, said you were the master of flight.
Yes, well, I did flight the ball quite well. I did flight it quite well, and that, of course, is what I relied on. That's why I was a much better bowler in Australia than in England, because and in South Africa and in the West Indies, because there was a bit of bounce in the wickets there, and the flight, if you deceived a batsman with flight, the ball would climb slightly, and it would accentuate any misjudgment on their part. I didn't bowl well in England because there was no bounce in the wickets there, and if you beat them with flight, they could easily correct their shot. The wickets were a bit slower.
How important was flight in your armoury?
It was a vital part of my armoury, absolutely vital. Flight and accuracy were the two things, and spin, of course, but flight was most important.
And how did you find the talent for this flight business? They seem to think it's a lost art.
I don't quite know whether it was anything to do with that chipped elbow I had that we spoke about earlier. I don't know. But I used to hold the ball deep in my hand and run the fingers across the top of it quite a bit and get quite a lot of overspin. And that, of course, is what makes the ball loop.
Now, before leaving the Hassetts and the Bradmans, name the best half-dozen cricketers beyond them in your time.
Well, John Bradman and Hassett, it's difficult to sort of keep them down to half a dozen. You've got Linville Miller, keeping to my time, I won't include Linville Miller, Weeks Worrell, Dudley Norris of South Africa, Hutton Compton. There are some to go on with. I mean, and there are so many very great players that it's difficult to just keep them down to six.
You mentioned Dudley Norris. Did you ever play the Wanderers?
The Wanderers ground, the old Wanderers ground, had been taken over by the railways that was in the city, and they were just constructing the new Wanderers, which was out a few miles.
Jack Fingleton wrote marvellously of the Wanderers, great feeling for the ground.
Yes, well, that would be the old Wanderers, which was right in the heart of the city, and the railways, as I say, took that over. But the new Wanderers is an absolutely superb club, superb club.
Your favourite cricket grounds?
I think Lord's. Lord's always disappoints you when you first see it. I remember the first time I was there in '48, I went up with Lindsay Hassett from the Tilbury when the ship docked, and he said, "Take your squash togs." Well, they became a squash while we were waiting for the luggage to arrive. And I'd always been told I'd be disappointed when I saw Lord's. And Lindsay said to me, "Now, you're going to be disappointed when you first see this place." And of course I was prepared to be disappointed and didn't think I would, naturally. But when I got there, I was disappointed. But after we practiced there once or twice, and after I played there, it really does grow on you. It's a fantastic place. And that was my favourite ground, yes.
In Australia?
I think probably Sydney. And that was when it was the old Sydney. I don't know how it would be with all of the stands around it now, but assuming it would have lost some of its charm, I'd rate Adelaide probably.
I was going to say, I thought for a man of flight and a fast wicket, Adelaide would be it.
Well, Sydney was always that way.
Anywhere else, if applicable?
Well, Newlands in South Africa is a glorious ground. That share is cradled under the Table Mountain. It's got a row of oak trees along one side. It's really a beautiful ground. That's probably the most beautiful of the major grounds, even more so than Adelaide.
Cricketers, you well know, have some great raconteurs, the Ernie McCormicks and the Freddie Trumans. Who gets the Academy Award?
I think I'd have to say Ernie McCormick, because I've heard Ernie tell stories and he's had me in fits of laughter. And when I've tried to reconstruct the story later, there's been no humour in it at all. And it was just the way Ernie told them. He was absolutely superb. I think I'd give Ernie number one.
And Freddie, of course, is most engaging personality.
Personality, yes, but I'd put Ernie first.
And the most renowned observer, because you had a career in your own right as a journalist.
Yes, well, I divide that into two. Most renowned observer. When you say observer, I would think Bob Menzies was probably the most renowned observer of the game. But when you get to the press hierarchy, you naturally think of Neville Cardis, but I always gave the accolade to Crusoe Robertson Glasgow, who was one of the great English writers. I liked his style even better than I liked Cardis's, and he was a very, very fair critic,